What if I told you that one of Hollywood's brightest stars is hiding behind the same lawyers who once fought the Jeffrey Epstein empire? What if I told you that the publicist tied to Harvey Weinstein is still pulling strings behind the scenes? And what if I told you that the silence of Taylor Swift, the hesitation of Hugh Jackman, and the defiance of Justin Baldoni are all colliding in a scandal that threatens to shatter the very foundation of Hollywood itself, Imogen stepping into a story so tangled, so layered with secrets and unexpected ties that every detail pulls you deeper into a world where nothing is as it seems and everything connects back to the most powerful names in Hollywood finance and politics, because this is not just about a court filing or a casual legal skirmish. This is about image control, about power plays, about carefully constructed narratives designed to protect reputations at all costs, and it begins with something that on the surface might seem like an ordinary press conference. A group of survivors standing on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., speaking truths that had been silenced for decades, exposing pain that most of us could never imagine. And yet the ripple effect of that moment stretched far beyond what the cameras captured, because hidden within their testimony was a connection, a thread that leads directly into the story of Blake Lively, her legal strategy, and the very attorneys she has chosen to stand by. Her side now, as I listened to those survivors, many of whom were speaking out for the first time ever, I could not shake the feeling that something larger was unfolding beneath the surface. They demanded accountability. They wanted every file unsealed, every name made public, every single individual who played a role in that dark chapter of history to finally face the light of truth. And as they spoke, I felt compelled to dig deeper. And what I discovered left me stunned, because standing behind one of those survivors was an attorney who has become a powerful figure in these kinds of battles, an attorney who has represented women silenced by some of the most influential men in the world. Her name, Sigrid Macaulay. And here is where the story twists, because this same attorney who helped represent victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell also happens to be representing Blake Lively and Leslie Sloane. And when that realization hit me, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Why would Blake Lively, whose situation could never be compared to what those survivors endured, align herself with the same attorney who fought against one of the most notorious exploitation rings in modern history? And the answer, though complicated, appears to come down to optics and power, because when you hire an attorney known for fighting on behalf of real survivors, you borrow some of their credibility. You step into their shadow and you project an image that you too are standing against. Injustice, that you too are a victim who needs protection. But here is where the suspense thickens, because Blake Lively is not a young girl lured into a dangerous trap. She is not someone from a disadvantaged background with no safety net. She is not someone stripped of power or resources. She is a wealthy actress married to one of the most financially successful actors of this era, a man whose business ventures alone span billions of dollars. This is not the profile of a vulnerable victim. This is the profile of someone with nearly unlimited access to resources. And yet, by choosing an attorney who has worked alongside Epstein survivors, she creates a narrative. She places herself in a storyline where she too is framed as someone harmed by forces larger than herself. And it raises the question, what is the strategy here? What is the end game? Because when you peel back the layers, it begins to look less like a desperate plea for justice and more like a calculated performance designed to evoke sympathy and to silence critics by association. And the more I examined the law firm itself, the deeper the irony became, because this is not just any firm. This is a firm that has profited immensely from some of the darkest scandals in recent history. On one hand, they proudly parade their victories for survivors, pointing to the millions upon millions won in settlements against banks that enabled Epstein's crimes. But on the other hand, this same firm has also stood behind powerful men accused of horrific misconduct. Men like Harvey Weinstein using every tactic available to discredit those who dared to speak out. And that contradiction sits at the very center of this story. Because if you are Blake Lively and you choose to tie yourself to this firm, you are not just hiring a lawyer. You are entering a legacy, a history that has seen both the defense of victims and the protection of abusers. It is a double-edged sword, one that can cut both ways. And yet for Blake and Leslie Sloane, this seems to be a risk worth taking, because aligning with a lawyer like Sigrid Macaulay creates the illusion of legitimacy and shields them from scrutiny, at least in the public eye. But as I untangled more of these connections, I realized just how strange and unsettling the web truly is, because Leslie Sloane herself has a history tied to Harvey Weinstein. Her PR firm funded by him, supported by him, and her career interwoven with his influence. And if that was not enough, Epstein and Weinstein themselves were linked once business partners in a potential magazine deal, publicly seen together, publicly aligned. And so when you follow this thread, it becomes clear that the same networks of power that once protected men like Epstein and Weinstein are now being navigated by people like Blake Lively and Leslie Sloane, except this time they are positioning themselves as the victims, as the ones in need of protection. And this is where the suspense builds, because you have to ask yourself why. Why choose a firm with such baggage? Why attach yourself to a name that brings with it both the weight of justice and the stain of scandal? And the answer may be more shocking than we think, because it is not about truth. It is about strategy. It is about perception. It is about building a narrative so compelling that it overshadows the messy reality underneath. And as this story unfolds, you begin to see how nothing here is coincidental. Every connection, every decision, every attorney chosen is part of a larger performance carefully staged to achieve maximum impact. And the longer you look, the more unsettling it becomes. As we peel back another layer of this tangled narrative, the contradictions grow sharper and the questions grow louder, because what begins as a simple observation of shared legal representation quickly transforms into a story that touches every corner of Hollywood, every hidden deal, and every backroom negotiation where reputations are protected and truth is carefully managed. And here lies the unsettling heart of this saga, that the same attorneys who once fought tooth and nail to secure justice for young women silenced by Jeffrey Epstein are now being used as a shield by one of the most privileged actresses in Hollywood. And that realization shifts the story from curious coincidence to calculated maneuver, because the choice of representation is never accidental in these circles. It is strategy. It is a performance. It is a chess move, played on a board where perception is more valuable than fact. And for Blake Lively and Leslie Sloane, the optics are everything, because when you present yourself alongside a firm that has stood in courtrooms listening to testimonies of unspeakable harm, you adopt that aura of legitimacy, you borrow that moral weight, and you wrap yourself in a cloak that says, I too have suffered, I too have been wronged. But here is where the suspense twists tighter, because behind that veneer lies a darker irony. These lawyers, this firm, have also defended men accused of covering up and silencing those very voices they now claim to amplify. And when you realize that, you begin to see the deeper game being played. It is not about aligning with truth. It is about controlling narrative, because Blake Lively has publicly admitted that her frustration stems not from trauma inflicted on set, but from what she described as a smear campaign. And when you connect that with the decision to hire lawyers known for fighting the most infamous abusers of power, it begins to resemble a script carefully designed for public consumption. A storyline, crafted to present her not as a privileged starlet caught in bad press, but as a survivor of forces stacked against her. And that is where the true power of narrative manipulation comes into view. Because this is not about whether or not she endured the worst Hollywood has to offer. This is about ensuring that the story told about her becomes one of sympathy, one of struggle, one of survival. And when you examine how her husband's fortune, how his empire of brands worth billions feeds into this equation, the contrast becomes startling, because the victims these lawyers originally represented came from worlds that could not be more different from Blake Lively. They were young girls from broken homes, struggling for survival. Some were homeless. Some came from families already fractured by incarceration or poverty. They were recruited under the pretense of $200 for a massage, and in that moment their lives were altered forever. That is the reality these attorneys built their reputations on, and yet here stands Blake Lively, standing under that same banner, despite never facing anything remotely close to that devastation. And the question becomes why, and the answer that whispers through every detail is credibility. Borrowed credibility. A strategic borrowing of legitimacy from survivors who cannot speak for themselves anymore, some of whom are no longer alive. Their voices used as scaffolding for someone else's narrative, and as this unfolds, you cannot help but feel the unease grow stronger. Because the deeper you go, the more connections surface, the more contradictions stand exposed, and suddenly you remember that Leslie Sloane, the publicist behind so much of this strategy, has her own ties, her own history woven with Harvey Weinstein. A man whose fall from power shook the very foundations of Hollywood, because Leslie's firm Vision PR was funded by him, backed by him. And when she left her previous position in disgrace, it was his money that built her comeback, and she did not just represent Blake. Lively, she represented Harvey himself. She represented some of his closest allies. She fought to shape narratives that minimized their wrongdoing. And yet now, she too hides behind the shield of attorneys who claim the mantle of justice for survivors. And that contradiction is staggering, because it reveals that in this world of power and image, the line between victim and protector, between survivor and enabler blurs, until you can barely tell them apart. And that is where the real suspense lies, because it is not just about who hires which lawyer. It is about the story being told. It is about how truth gets rewritten, how credibility gets laundered through associations, and how public sympathy becomes a currency, traded as strategically as money in the bank. And once you see that you cannot unsee it, every detail becomes a clue. Every past connection becomes a shadow, looming over the present. Every carefully crafted press release becomes a stage direction in a play that has been rehearsed long before the audience was invited to watch, and that is the unsettling brilliance of this entire saga. It is not random, it is not coincidental. It is orchestrated, every move made with precision, every connection leveraged for effect, every contradiction buried beneath the weight of a larger narrative. And as the tension builds, you are left with one haunting question. What is the real story here? And now, as the dust begins to rise, and the whispers in backrooms turn into headlines splashed across glossy covers, the Hollywood machine roars to life because the industry thrives on contradictions, it feeds on scandal, it devours hypocrisy, and when a story like this breaks, it is not merely entertainment, it becomes survival for those whose careers are tethered to public perception. And already the media has seized on the irony with think pieces, dissecting every inconsistency op-eds, questioning how a woman who once laughed on late-night couches about the perks of fame now wraps herself in the cloak of survivalism and commentary panels debating whether credibility is a commodity that can be purchased like designer gowns. And the outrage is not confined to journalists. It is spreading across celebrity circles where alliances are fragile, and every friendship is weighed against the risk of association. Some stars whisper in support, framing Blake Lively as a target of relentless scrutiny, while others bristle at the audacity of equating her frustrations with the devastation faced by the powerless. And it is here that the backlash begins to boil because the survivors themselves, their families, their advocates are watching in disbelief at the spectacle being built atop their pain, and social media amplifies their fury. Voices echoing in unison that this appropriation of legitimacy is a betrayal, a theft of stories that were never hers to borrow, and that chorus grows louder. Every hour, hashtags trend, demanding accountability threads unravel years of carefully crafted image, and with every revelation the facade cracks wider, and the public begins to question not only Blake Lively, but the system that allowed her to stand beneath the same banner as those who fought real monsters, and the consequences ripple outward, because Hollywood is a town built on reputations, and those reputations are crumbling under the weight of contradiction. Ryan Reynolds, once celebrated as the charming mogul husband, now faces scrutiny for whether his billion-dollar empire insulated this strategy, whether his silence is complicity, whether his money funded the narrative, and industry insiders whisper that cracks are forming behind closed doors, friends distancing themselves, collaborators reconsidering deals, producers questioning whether association is worth the risk. And then there is the chilling silence from some of Hollywood's most powerful voices, those who once stood arm in arm at Me Too rallies, those who vowed that no woman's story would be overshadowed. And yet here they pause, hesitating, caught between loyalty to an industry peer and the recognition that silence itself is complicity. And the public sees this hesitation and reads it as betrayal, and the outrage deepens, because every silence, every carefully worded no comment, feels like another betrayal of the truth. And within this storm, one voice cuts through louder than most, the survivors themselves. Some who step forward in interviews, some who speak through advocates, some who take to platforms directly, their words heavy with grief and anger because their suffering is not a prop, their lives not a shield for the privileged, and their defiance pierces the glossy image Hollywood has tried to drape over this story. And the more they speak, the more the narrative shifts away from sympathy for a starlet and toward condemnation for an industry that continues to recycle the same cycle of power, image, and control. And Hollywood feels that shift like an earthquake. Premieres become tense. Red carpets bristle with unspoken questions, and even casual interviews turn sharp as reporters slip in pointed remarks testing whether stars will defend Blake Lively or distance themselves, and those who hesitate, those who dodge, find themselves dragged online, accused of cowardice, accused of choosing comfort over conscience. and the backlash grows not because the public delights in tearing down a celebrity, but because the betrayal feels so visceral, because the borrowing of survivor narratives feels like a theft too cruel to ignore. And as this firestorm rages, the suspense only tightens. What deal will crumble first? What ally will defect? What headline will twist the knife deeper? Because every hour, this saga escalates. Every revelation becomes another domino falling. And the truth hiding beneath it all becomes harder to ignore. That this was never about justice. It was always about narrative. Always. About control, always about survival in an industry where survival itself is performance. And now the storm shifts from vague whispers to names that carry the weight of entire industries. Because when Taylor Swift speaks, the world listens. And though she has not issued a direct statement, her silence itself has become deafening. A silence, dissected in think pieces and fan theories. A silence that to many reads as deliberate. Because Taylor Swift has built her empire on the power of her voice, on the precision of her narratives, and to say nothing when her closest friend is embroiled in accusations of manipulating survivor narratives is not neutrality. It is strategy. And the speculation grows louder. Some insisting that Taylor will eventually step in to defend others, certain that she is already preparing to distance herself. Calculating the cost of loyalty against the cost of credibility, and every movement of hers is studied, every lyric, every social post, every paparazzi capture, treated like evidence in a trial where perception is the only verdict. And then there is Hugh Jackman, whose connection to both Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds places him in an impossible position, because the man who built his reputation as Hollywood's gentleman now finds himself dodging questions in airports and on sidewalks, reporters pressing microphones to his face, fans shouting for answers. And though he smiles and waves, the hesitation in his eyes betrays the truth that he is caught in a web he cannot untangle, because to defend them risks tainting his own legacy, but to abandon them risks severing friendships decades in the making, and in that hesitation the public senses weakness. And weakness in Hollywood becomes scandal, and then enters Justin Baldoni, whose battle with Blake Lively in court has already lit up headlines. And his response is not silence, it is precision. His legal team uses the moment to underscore what they have argued from the start. That Blake Lively has twisted narratives to her advantage, that she has blurred the line between discomfort and devastation, that she has borrowed the weight of others' stories to shield herself. And though his words come from court filings and official statements, the undertone is unmistakable, a sharp condemnation wrapped in professionalism, and suddenly he becomes the unexpected voice of reason in a storm where so many have stayed quiet. His defiance painting him not just as a man fighting for his reputation, but as someone willing to puncture the carefully curated facade of a Hollywood darling. And the contrast could not be sharper, because while Blake Lively leans on narrative manipulation, Baldoni leans on exposure, revealing connections, revealing contradictions. And the public is watching the scales shift one headline at a time. And all the while, social media explodes, fans of Taylor Swift demanding clarity, fans of Hugh Jackman pleading for answers, fans of Baldoni hailing him as vindicated, and critics of Blake Lively relentless in their pursuit of every inconsistency, every contradiction, every moment where her image does not match her actions, and the outrage becomes a spectacle. Hashtags trending across platforms, memes circulating, dissecting the hypocrisy parody accounts, mocking the very strategy meant to shield her, and even late night hosts begin to slip in jokes. Sharp barbs disguised as comedy, but carrying the sting of public judgment and Hollywood feels. The temperature rise, studios hesitate to attach her name to projects. Brands quietly distance themselves, whispers of contracts under review, and what was once dismissed as noise now takes shape as consequence. Because Hollywood survives on image, and once an image cracks, it rarely heals. And within this chaos, you see the fractures spreading through her inner circle. Leslie Sloane scrambling to control the press cycle, issuing carefully worded statements that fool no one, spinning contradictions into narratives of strength. But every statement only deepens the sense of artifice. Every crafted phrase only confirming what the public already suspects, that this is performance, not truth. And the louder the defense, the weaker it sounds, and the more the public turns to the voices outside her circle, the survivors, the critics, the colleagues who risk their own reputations, to call out the hypocrisy, and slowly the tide shifts until the narrative Blake Lively tried to build collapses under its own contradictions. And all that remains is the haunting question of how much further the fallout will spread, because when Taylor Swift finally speaks, when Hugh Jackman finally cracks, when Justin Baldoni continues to press the truth, the story will not just consume Blake Lively, it will consume the very foundation of Hollywood credibility itself. And so the curtain begins to fall on a story that has shaken Hollywood, not because of the spectacle of celebrity, but because of the uncomfortable truths it has forced into the light. The truth that power protects itself. The truth that image is often more valuable than honesty. The truth that even the most sacred narratives of survival can be borrowed, twisted, repackaged, and sold back to the public as performance. And in that recognition, the outrage grows heavier, because the people see clearly now that this was never just about one actress or one publicist or one law firm. It was about an entire system designed to shield the privileged while exploiting the pain of the powerless. And in that system, silence becomes complicity, strategy becomes morality, and loyalty becomes currency. And yet the cracks are undeniable, because once the curtain slips, once the contradictions are exposed, they cannot be unseen. And no amount of glossy interviews or polished red carpet smiles can restore what has been lost. Because credibility once broken is rarely repaired, and so Blake Lively finds herself not at the center of a redemption arc, but trapped in a cautionary tale of what happens when the desire for control outweighs the demand for truth. And those around her, from Reynolds to Leslie Sloane, to the lawyers who built their names on the backs of survivors, must now confront the shadows of their choices. Because the public will not forget. The survivors will not forgive, and Hollywood will not shield. Forever. And as the lights dim and the audience leaves, only one question lingers. Will this story end as another scandal consumed by the machine, or as the spark that finally forces the industry to confront its own reflection?